thank you for joining me as I present to you as part of the Early Childhood Voices Conference. Many thanks to Sturt University and the team there for having us. My name is Elise Hunkin and I am presenting on a project to you today on behalf of my colleagues Professor Jayne and Fiona Westbrook. Our project is entitled Don't Shoot the Messenger, Exploring Tensions in Research Translation for Stakeholder End Users in the Early Childhood Sector. Before I begin, although I am coming to you today from my home in Melbourne, I am also reminded that in addition to where I live, where I work, research and teach, and all the business that we do here at RMIT occurs on the unceded lands of the Eastern Kulin Nations. And so I'd like to offer my respect to them now before I begin, and to their elders, both past and current and emerging. Now, much emphasis is currently being placed on the role of research translation and impact, particularly for end users and particularly for industry, we find now as part of the business of the university. So what we're going to present to you today is a project that we undertook with RMIT internal funding that was targeted on supporting researchers to take data and actually translate that out and circulate that out amongst end users in a really impactful way. Jayne and I are co-chief investigators of the Australian arm of what is an international research project around infants' early transitions. So we know that there is an enormous amount of information and resourcing available for parents and services and educators when children are making that transition from kindergarten or an early childhood setting to school. But what our research project looks at is actually when children make that first transition from home to childcare or another type of early childhood service, and what the experiences are that are occurring in that setting, and how we can support all of those stakeholders in having a better experience. Unfortunately, we have found there is really very little, almost no information currently available to support educators and families who are in this space. So our goal in this project was to be able to translate the research from our international team into something that was going to be a very visual and easy to use tool for families and educators who are, who are at this stage in their transition journey. If you'd like to know more about the work, particularly the project's findings from New Zealand, I've got the website there for you, earlytransitions.com. We are a 5-country study, so we actually have representatives from all over every continent in the world, and principally our methods are visual in the sense that we are using video to observe children's first moments as they move into the new setting. I won't elaborate too much on the larger project, because what I want to talk to you today on behalf of the team is the RMIT funded project that we undertook for translation and impact, and we called this First Steps. Here I've just got a slide for you on the project design of First Steps. If we start here at the left, you'll see that First Steps aimed to use the international data. We had an enormous corpus of data that we could draw from. The challenge then was actually how to translate that into something that was going to be usable for the sector. So we wanted to couple the international data with the Victorian Steering Committee to decide and then design some end user products. So going into the project, and when we pitched it to the RMIT internal committees, we actually didn't know what those end products were going to be when we were making the pitch. But what we wanted to do was involve this steering committee so that they could actually tell us what the sector wanted and needed from their perspective. And we could work that into our goals, which of course were these easy to use, easy to share resources that could be free, And our thoughts at that point were that we might utilise social media and some of the more informal networks to make sure that these translated products had the impact that we wanted. Once we had met with our international team and also our local steering committee, and we had some sense of the kinds of products that they were looking for, which ended up being infographics and videos, short videos, we went ahead and designed those videos and then went through a process where we had our intended end users test those products. So we had educators, mostly from South Australia, who tested the products. We had families, early childhood management, our steering committee, and also the international research team, who all went through and had a look at those final products and gave us some input. So what we're presenting on today, what's in focus for us today, are our reflections on some of the tensions that were unearthed over that process. Of course, there's always tensions when we're working to represent different groups of people, even within the same industry or the same sector. What we were interested in today, talking about today, is specifically how those tensions need to come into consideration when researchers are looking to do something like translate data, particularly when you're translating data and research on behalf of stakeholders. Okay, to give you an idea of what we're talking about, this is one of the infographics this is the infographic that we have had designed for the project. 5 principles for effective infant transitions to early childhood education and care. I'm aware that this is quite small, so I have prepared another slide with a little more of an in-depth focus for you, because I want to draw your attention in particular to our third point, which was make space for grief. We found overwhelmingly that in the interviews with the parents who were taking their children to these first and second and third days of childcare, they were really clear that they felt a lot of grief, and also they were very clear that it was important to them that the educators told them that this was happening. So, for example, we heard from families who said that they would pick their children up after a visit and they could see that the child had been crying, but the educators would reassure them that everything was okay. So our focus in this infographic was really bringing through that message that we had gotten from families. You can see here the first point is communicate honestly. And the third one is make space for grief. So our message here was really clear that it's actually okay if things are difficult, because that's the realistic pathway that we're looking at. We wanted to equip educators and other stakeholders perhaps with some strategies for working with those difficulties. What was interesting then, and I have called this first tension optimism, what was interesting for us was that in the evaluations that we got back of the infographic, the key input that we got from stakeholders, and this was overwhelmingly an educator stakeholder group. We had between 50 and 70 of our surveys come back to us. Only 2% were families. They were harder for us to access because of the COVID happenings, as you would imagine. And so the majority were early childhood management. So what the feedback from them was they wanted a more positive spin. They were concerned about the fact that we were using words particularly like grief and that we had images of crying children. Since that was our intention, we found that really quite interesting as something then to reflect on. Moving on, we also created a few different memes that we wanted to use as ways to draw attention to the resourcing. And I won't talk on them for too long because, as you will see, the memes were not well received. Apologies there, because I can see that the video is actually covering some of the text. But the quotes there are just highlighting that they didn't like the tongue-in-cheek tone of the memes and they wanted them to appear more professional. This was a very consistent theme in a lot of our feedback. So we've identified it here as a second tension, which is professionalism, or the professional identity, let's say, of the different stakeholders. I think the industry stakeholders that gave us feedback were quite clear that they they wanted the sector to be uplifted and presented in a professional, courteous manner in the products that we were using. From our perspective, of course, we were also trying to appeal to families. And so professionalism wasn't in a way our first priority so much as things being easy to access and understand. So I'll talk about this more later, but the memes we certainly did drop quite quickly because they weren't serving the purpose that we wanted them to, which just that they would pique people's interests. But some of this, the two quotations at the top, it is informative and factual, but not overly encouraging. They're actually in relation to one of the videos that we made. I don't have time in this presentation to show you through some of the videos, but I will provide you with links in a moment. The final tension we found in this feedback that we needed to think through were really that there were quite deep-seated and traditional values of the sector. And so if we were trying to communicate a message that it was felt didn't correspond well to those traditional values, we did get some pushback. So that quotation there that's, I apologise, is covered, was to take away the graphics of somebody holding up flashcards to an infant because it was inappropriate. Some other suggestions included that we should have had real people and not animation. Obviously, considering the ethical considerations in our budget, that wasn't a possibility. There was also a request, the first voiceover that we did for one of our videos was a man with I suppose we would characterise it as an Asian accent. We had multiple requests that would be changed to a woman without a discernible accent or with an Australian accent. And we had multiple requests that the infographic and the two videos could be edited so that different centres could change it to fit their procedures or their policies. The last one that we found interesting was that we did have multiple requests that these resources be something that children would find appropriate or accessible, which again speaks to some of the traditional values of the sector, which we're not here to critique, but is interesting to us because obviously we're talking here about infants. And so the appropriateness of then being able to create something that would be impactful then for families and educators and infants, it does seem unlikely. So in responding to these tensions around optimism, presenting an optimistic front, presenting a professional front, and presenting something that was traditional to the values of the sector, we did take the following actions. We abandoned the memes. Although we were quite fond of them, they will not now be used. We did re-record the voiceover, and we did use a woman because it does then acknowledge that the majority of the workforce are female. We updated some of the imagery, removing flashcards, and while we did keep the image of a crying baby, which was raised as an issue, we did resolve that crying as part of the video. And we updated some of the language to reflect that these things were, all of our advice was contextual. We also included language that would remind the audience that this was based on research rather than perhaps their individual service. So as a team, we've got a number of final thoughts, and we're still working through these in a paper that we'll write on the basis of this presentation. But it did raise lots of questions for us about what happens when research findings, when data sit in tension to some of the views and the wants and perhaps the interests of other key stakeholders. And here I think the most immediate example of that is when families are clearly asking us to, or suggesting to us in the research project that grief and sadness be acknowledged, and educators and management are asking us that it is not acknowledged because it's not encouraging. So what's the role then of the researcher when we're trying to translate our research data and there are those tensions between stakeholders? also rose questions for us about, of course, what's the researcher's responsibility and to whom. Obviously, in this project, because we had identified multiple end users and we wanted the resources to be able to be relevant across end users, our responsibility as we saw it then was to balance the interests of all of those groups as best as we could, and that's what we've attempted to do. But it would be our recommendation to those who are looking to engage in similar projects that you might perhaps think about targeting different resources in some instance at singular end user groups so that you can balance some of those vested interests and values a little bit better. We also found, and this is more of a practical note, we were advised and we decided in our original pitch not to budget for having a website or a particular holding place for the resources, because we wanted them to be something that was more informal and that was shared more easily amongst the stakeholders. But we have now found ourselves with a little bit of a conundrum in that we don't know really where to hold these resources, and as it turns out we will be holding them in a website, which I'll direct you to in a moment. So even though it might not perhaps be a fashionable, easy to pitch sort of idea to make a website, we would probably, in reflection, encourage that someone embarking on a similar project think about doing that. And finally, if you'd like to learn more, this has been a brief presentation. We're very grateful for your attention. If you would like to learn more, I have here the website for our research lab, and you'll see the icon up here in the top left, what we call the POP lab, or the Pedagogies of Possibility lab, where we group and host research projects like this at RMIT. So you can simply Google RMIT POP lab, or you can follow that link I've given you and you'll find more information about the project. Alternatively, you can visit earlytransitions.com, which I mentioned earlier is principally reflecting on the New Zealand project and their data, but of course they are drawing on some of the work between countries and across countries. And lastly, you can read the newest publication from the international team, Expectations and Emotions Concerning Infant Transitions to Early Childhood Education and Care, International Dialogues with Parents and Teachers. I hope you've enjoyed what I had to tell you today. I'd like to thank my project members, Jayne White, and also Fiona Westbrook, who was our research assistant on this project. I'd also like to thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions or you'd like any further information, I'll just redirect you here to my email address as the corresponding first author, Elise Hunkin at rmit.edu.au. Thank you for joining us.